All right. So a couple weeks ago we finished our pool game, or at least we finished a novel's worth of this pool game in this setting that we created, and so I wanted to have a conversation about that. Just what we did, like going back through the game and the different events, and like what we did, how we responded to everything, how we used the rules. Let me just check and see if I'm actually being picked up by the mic. Yeah, looks like I am. And so I guess I thought I'd start by just going back to like the beginning of and remembering what the process was of starting it and what we did at the first. And it started out when I had shown you that I showed you this picture from a Japanese video game that I'll put on the screen. Um, and just said, well, try making up pool characters that sort of respond to this picture in some way. And you made up these two, John, you made up this sort of monk or failed monk or something like that. And then Sean made up the Lotus Seer, who was this persecuted religious figure running from someone. And then I just, based on that, I threw together, and I think it was the day of. Was it day of? Like, I just threw it together in 15 or 20 minutes after I saw your characters, and I just
believe
sort of,
so.
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah.
And so I kind of came up with this idea that there was this sort of empire that was oppressive, and you would be coming into this little town in the mountains that I called Crossways, and there was this sort of army who was collecting souls for the emperor. That is, they had this gigantic, like, frog-shaped furnace called the Soul Cauldron. I found it. It's in the book. It was called in my little notebook. It was called the Soul Cauldron, and they were just gonna throw people in here so their life forces could fuel the emperor. And I think at the time I vaguely had the idea that this was connected to him somehow. Like, the pretext was him somehow defending the empire, but I think that's all I knew at that time. But I had sort of, John, your character Giacron, I sort of, you had said he was in this like monastery in the mountains, so I had you actually coming down from the monastery after having a fight with your abbot, I guess. And I forget, did we actually play that out in the first session? I think we flashed.
We
through
did.
it. Okay.
Well, we did have it. I think I forget if we played it out or you were like, what was it about? We played it out.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
We knew that the outcome. We knew what the outcome was going to be. But we did kind of play out the
Okay.
interaction.
Okay, and so you came down, and then the Lotus Seer was traveling through, and she was sort of incognito, trying to get away from the center of the persecution. And so I just kind of set up this scenario where they were rounding up these people and about to throw them in this cauldron, and just see how you reacted to it. And I think I had a character. I had made up this sort of antagonist named Varga, who was the captain of this army, and or this little army detachment. And so you kind of responded to the situation. And what do you remember about, like, what I remember is you sort of, like, you got it. I remember Giacron kind of getting into it with them and trying to, like,
Yeah.
disrupt the proceedings. And I remember, in terms of the pool, what I remember is this first session was a place where you both sort of used monologues of victory to just establish what your various types of mystical powers were, right? Like, in this first. Oh, I should put on headphones. I'm getting some echo. Just a sec. What was I talking about? Oh, well, you had sort of, so you kind of used this monologue of Giacron fighting against these soldiers to establish that he had these, like, transportation or it was kind of teleporty, but you always
Yeah.
had a particular
It,
way of describing it.
yeah, I think what I was thinking is like he can, or as I described it, like he can. I guess I settled on the idea that like, you know, he can ignore the he can ignore physics. Like that's like what the Sun Top monks teach, that you can transcend the material plane,
Right.
which means that like he can be in one place and then another without having to actually like move through,
Right. Right.
you know, he kind of physically be there. And that was the all of and then once I decided like all of those Sun Top monk powers had to be based on that special effect, more or less, like that is essentially like that he can warp, you know, distances and time in that way. And I think I was fairly consistent
Yeah, I
with
think
that.
so. I think that that remained kind of how it worked for the entire game.
I, I don't know. I think one of these things, like, you know, people maybe who haven't played, or I used to, I come across this with people who are talking about these games who haven't played them, who are kind of like asking about them, who've heard about them, or I've seen it to a certain extent in play. This idea that like, oh, in games like the pool where you have these traits, um, are you aren't you tempted to just like spam a trait so you're like using it all the time and like really broadly using it, you know, you want to be like, oh, you know what I'm saying? Like there's this maybe a fear because it's maybe not reality based, but also maybe something that I guess I actually have seen in some games where like you've got like the trait, so you're like bending it. You're either like, oh, I'm coming up for like a reason why like this particular thing is always applicable, or I'm just always going back to the same trait over and over again
Yeah.
because and like forcing everything into it because like that's like the way for success.
Yeah.
And and I I guess I think that's a somewhat legitimate concern, although it's lame to do it, right? Like
Yeah.
that's the problem, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So if I was super flexible and like the Sun Top monk powers could sort of be anything, like if I could like summon an elemental or something, like if
Right.
I was like at the last one, well, I'm going to use the Sun Top monk powers to summon an elemental, to do my bidding, in the last session, for example, that would have been just bad, like in my
Right.
opinion. Like you know, would it be something where anyone could say like, no, you actually can't do that? Um, I don't know, but it would have been bad. So I think that's more important, like aesthetically, like you can, you know, you still have to want to you still want to have to play well to a certain
Right. Right.
extent, right? Like you still, like the game isn't going to stop you from making lame choices.
Right.
I guess that's kind of my point. It's like I think that's what people are like, oh, but how can the game stop you from being lame? And it's like it can't. Maybe
Right.
you will be lame.
Right.
Um, in the Napoleonic fantasy pool game I ran, this is an example of not being lame, but one of the characters had just the trait was just like magic, and that was fairly flexible the way he used magic and was continuing to like do different things. But in that game, what kind of to balance that, we knew that using magic always was like a sort of a big deal. Like the consequences of failing with magic were much bigger, or potentially much more reality altering, or like could really change things or mess things up. So the even though that was much more flexible than like my Sun Top monk abilities, and we used it for more things, it didn't become like a spamming situation because we kind of established that no, there's a cost to it, and there's like it's not like it's like a powerful world changing thing when we start to use the magic. So my Sun Top monk powers weren't quite like that, but I think they were narrow enough so it didn't become lame, in my opinion.
Right. Right. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that they were great. I mean, I'm not like saying like they were like they were necessarily a great idea, but like at least I think I didn't fall into like spamming or lameness, or like, you know, becoming very overly flexible to the point of meaningless, where they became meaningless. I think they kind of developed like their own thing, and I think I kept to it. But yeah, I started that was what those first session happened. That's kind of establishing what that looked like and kind of his aesthetic. Anyways, I have more to say about kind of development, but I'll stop there for now.
Okay.
Well, I think too that all along you stuck with everything you did. I think was thematically appropriate, right? You sort of established what your character could do, and then you did things associated with that. I think that's perfectly exactly how you should do it, right? So it wasn't suddenly like, oh, I pull a gun out or something absurd, right? Yeah. Or I crawl down the moon and smash the Earth with it, you know.
Yeah, for example. Yeah.
I think I mentioned this in some conversation about Champions Now, but there's an very early issue of Thor where he like spins his hammer in a certain way to absorb the radiation from the uranium or whatever. Like there's a bunch of really wacky stuff that he does that does come off as ridiculous until like the concept of the character settles down, right? Until like, okay, this is what it's actually about. But it's kind of funny.
No, I think that's a good point, because I think there's like I think it's good to be like you don't want to be too afraid of being lame, because sometimes that's how you figure out what is actually going to be good.
Right.
You know, so I think that's I think that's actually a really good point. Like sometimes you need to be like, actually, or be like, I did that, but I don't really like it, and I don't think I'm gonna do that again.
Yeah.
I think that's like a fair way to approach it. Like I wouldn't want people second guessing themselves because they're super worried. But
right.
But yeah, I think it's like either self-correcting or not, but it's not like a problem with the system or like a worry. It's just like you got to want to do it right.
Yeah.
And so it's down to like why are we doing this? And it's like, well, we're doing this because we want to, ideally, because we think it's gonna be like a compelling story, and not because I want to like just everything that I want, like everything that is in his path to be bested by some ridiculous explanation that I can come up with.
Right.
But
and so like continuing, I guess, with that first session, I think we've talked about some of the stuff in the previous conversation, but just other things I remember. I think Giacron got captured. Like you had failed a roll to like evade some guys as you were trying to get into I don't remember all the specifics, but I do remember there was a couple of like you fought some dudes, you fought Varga, then you got captured, and the beats of the story felt really satisfying as an action sequence, I thought, without needing much like orchestration from the just describing things that people were doing and using the system to see if you succeeded or failed. It felt pretty good, I thought.
Yeah, I found that been fairly that piece at least fairly consistently in my pool playing over the last year. Like, especially if you like let one role kind of set up the circumstances, like for the next role in the immediate situation. Yeah, I think you can get some interesting dynamism and kind of like this.
Yeah, dynamic.
The choreography of the action becomes really fun.
Yeah, dynamism is a good way to put it, and it's I thought it was interesting and kind of gratifying, especially in comparison. Like I had played like the previous years. I played a fair amount of Champions Now, and that was a very dynamic game with a lot of orchestration, right, on the game mechanics level, and this like speed chart and timing your actions. But like just doing it with like just having a reasonably interesting situation and attention to what people are doing in the situation turned out to be just fine. Like compared to Champions Now, like the beats would be like broader, right? It's not like every second. It's a little more is happening per roll, well, maybe not per roll, but
more. I mean, yes, you're.
You know, it's a different it's a different pace, but it's still a validly exciting and actiony pace.
Yeah.
So that was kind of, and so you had gotten captured, and then the Lotus Seer, Sean, as the Lotus Seer. I forget. You were kind of laying. I thought you were kind of laying low during the first part of that session. I can't remember exactly what was going on, but you did have a big moment where you kind of like the crowd was like, oh, they were drawing lots to see who would get thrown in the furnace, and you manipulated that thing. And we talked about that role in the first video we did, where you know, used your powers. And I think this was the first big like exposition of what your powers were about, where you used your powers to manipulate this lottery so that they couldn't draw a number, and like this sort of, you sort of set this up to create like unrest in the town, and then you snuck away and freed Giacron. And this was sort of a thing where I remember also just having you find him and free him off the basis of your success of that role, because it seemed reasonable. That was an interesting point where I could have made a decision. I could have made a decision that I think there should be another step in the process where you're trying to get to him and free him, but I just decided that there wasn't. And you know, I just didn't want to set up that situation. Like, I thought, let's get on to the next thing. Let's get on to what this is ultimately going to be about, which is, you know, whether you successfully, because I knew you wanted to like sort of attempt to destroy the Soul Cauldron or attempt to disperse the soldiers, do something like that, and I wanted to get onto that. And that's sort of an interesting thing to think about in light of like the last year or two of Adept Play discussion, where, you know, like when I was talking to you and Alan about like decisions I've made, and to John and Alan about decisions I made in sorcerer games, that's the kind of decision that I think I would have been pretty tense about just sort of a year ago, or like a couple years ago, whether it's legitimate for me to, you know, whether I'm taking my control over the situation too far if I say, well, you go ahead and get him out. And yeah, I don't think there's a real answer. I don't think there's a like yes or no answer to this atomic situation, you know, like look at this situation under a microscope and get a yes or no answer. I think it's probably, you know, looking at the whole course of the game and the course of all those decisions you make, you could probably come to a conclusion about whether, well, you could probably look at a bunch of decisions and think, I think I'm being a little too loose with this, I need to tighten up, or the other way around. But that was, I think, the first decision where I kind of made a note to myself to think about that material. But I was perfectly satisfied with that decision when I made it. And anyway, so
well,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, it just, you know, I don't even know if I thought about the time. Maybe I was anticipating another role, but I don't think when I just, you know, when I was able to free the character, it felt like it was appropriately.
Consequence.
I guess it felt like it was enough. Yeah. I mean, it was going with the rhythm of the game at that point, right? Mm-hmm. You know, I think, you know, like John said, like the action beats, right? It felt right? I guess from my point of view.
It's hard because there's no. I think you're right. Like, there's no way to. So, I think of it. You know, this is kind of similar in the game I played with Ron and Sam, the Bulwark game. There was a scene where Sam's character was kind of waiting. Someone was trying to break into a room that Sam's character was hiding in, and basically there was a role. And Sam's character did have a gun, but there was a role, and the role was like, can Sam's character keep her keep her head around her? Can she stop from freaking out? And succeeded on that role, like kind of succeeded on that role. And then when the guy came through the door and Sam's character was like, "Well, I'm going to shoot him," I was like, "Okay, that's not a role." And so, because in my thinking was, well, if he kept his head and then like the guy came through the door, then you get the drop on him, then there's not a conflict. Like that's just kind of what it is. You mastered the situation that was important, and then like the other thing is like, no, you want to do that, that's fine, that's what happens. Like,
Right.
so I think that's like a powerful thing. And but then thinking back on it, I was like, someone else sitting in my position might have said like, no, that's definitely a role, like because keeping your head and the guy getting through the door is a different thing once they're here, and like maybe something else, which I think is completely legit. And I think in another situation, like even me being in that situation, I might have chosen something differently. So I don't think there's like I think you can look at any of these situations and be like, well, you could do it this way or that way, but ultimately, like, the point is you got to do it and then sort of own it, and then it's, and I think the game works. Like, I think like I think you could, like, I think what you say is astute too. Like, if you like look back on the game and like the only time you call for roles is like when you like are trying to like push things in a certain direction, or you're trying to like stymie certain things, and like then you can be like, hey, maybe I'm not like really paying attention to like what when I should be calling for roles, and maybe I'm missing things, but that's just, but again, like that's not what's happening. So on an individual basis, I think the GM does have, it's their job to like sort of say like, yeah, this makes sense that they can just do that. That's in the context, like, yes, it makes sense that their character could do that, what's the, it's sort of like, there's, I think there's a certain amount of like, I mean, I think that's part of what the traits are in the story is too, is to say like, look, these are the, this is the realm of action of these characters, or this is what they are about. And sometimes, like, if you're acting within that realm, like, okay, that's not a conflict or a role, that's just you do it,
Right.
For example. Anyways.
Characters being good at what they're good at.
Yeah.
Anyways, but I think, I mean, that's a little bigger than what we're talking about, but but yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And so you had freed him, and then there was you did eventually, then there was sort of a scene where you led the people in an uprising against this army, and you ended up with a combination of that, and I think you physically fought Varga or humiliated him in some way, or but he got away. But you did. Okay, so and you had the people. I think this was off, John, maybe off your role. You had a monologue of victory where the people like rocked the soul cauldron over and broke the soul gem to let all the souls free, and so that was kind of an interesting. Like, I think that was a thing that didn't necessarily have to happen off your success, but you did monologue to include that in there, and that made perfect sense to me. I don't know if you had any specific thoughts about that, or just a good moment.
No, I don't think so. No specific thoughts, but
right. And then that's where we kind of left it for the first session, and then after that, I kind of asked you what you thought your characters would go less. Well, you had sort of, I guess Giacron had decided to hook up with the Lotus Seer as kind of a traveling companion, platonically hook up, I should clarify. But I sort of asked you where you thought you would go. Oh yeah, I made the map. So after that session, I kind of went into like, I was excited about the world, and I kind of went into a little bit of world building mode, and I had this notebook that I think I had just bought on a whim, and I made a map in it, which I'll put the actual picture of this, but I really like these. I bought this notebook at Barnes and Noble. It comes with little stickers that you can put on the side and like
Nice.
sticker your title to your notebook, and there's a page of contents so you can table of contents so you can refer to the pages that you need to refer to. And that actually was very helpful. I mean, I know you can just write a table of contents in a blank notebook, but I had never thought of doing that before, so the fact that it's actually here got me to do that, which was neat. Anyway, so I made this map and I sort of showed it to you and I asked you what you thought you would be doing, and you just said, well, I'd be going as far away from the empire as possible. And so, in addition to making this map, I thought a little bit. This is where I had started thinking a little bit about what the general. Like, I knew there was this emperor. Emperor Adonis was kind of this big oppressive force. And then when you went to Destina, you decided to go to this city called Destina. And so I was like, all right, well, I'll make up what's going on there. And I did that by using, like, I think I used a character from from the Lotus Seers background.
Yeah.
You would sort of name this trait that you had been trained by Coricus in magic, and so I was like, well, maybe I use this guy. And I went and it's at this time that I kind of got the picture together of what the whole empire was about, and the idea that there was this other group, the Night Lords. I went back to the picture and chose like the guy with the spiky hat and decided he would be this other like sort of dominating character, that there were these Night Lords who were aristocrats living in these orbital cities. I don't know, something about a lot of these, what I've seen from some of these Japanese like role-playing game type video games, they kind of have this science fantasy vibe. Like, I guess Final Fantasy VII is probably the big example of that. And so I sort of, because the picture is in a related style, I clued into that and decided there were these orbital colonies, and that somehow the emperor was like using this ancient technology to defend the empire against them. But that there was this city, because you were going to Destina, and to highlight that conflict, I came up with the idea that, oh well, there's this, they're on the edge of the empire, and they could go either way. Like, there's the Night Lords have made this petition to them, and there's this conflict. There's this like electoral conflict in the city over whether to like join the Night Lords as vassals or to stick with the empire, which some people felt wasn't doing them any good. And then like Coricus was like the tie-breaking vote. I decided he was like a wizard who had trained you, and he was the dean of this university in Destina that was very important. One thing I think I talked about over the next couple of sessions that I played in this was that I was a little disappointed that I frequently didn't have a clear idea of what this place looked like, which is interesting because a lot of the enjoyment I get from fantasy is visual. Like, I like to see the picture of the place or the cover of the book, but in making up places in a role-playing game, like especially when in this situation where I'm the game master and I kind of have the responsibility.
Sorry, you just broke up a second. Sorry.
Oh, did I?
Yeah, you broke up for me a second. What were you saying?
Mic check. Well, so I was just talking about how when I was first making up this Destiny stuff, like I concentrated a lot on trying to get these characters down and names of characters and the relationships of characters and what the Night Lords are like. But I didn't like actually think much about like what the city looked like or felt like. I think we kind of ended up deciding that it was kind of vaguely Italian, like Florence-y, which kind of played into that. That and the combination of the idea that there was this empire ended up creating this whole kind of leaning on Roman Empire or Italian, Roman ideas as kind of a basis for imagining what this civilization looked like. And I think that's fine, but it's interesting that I was a little disappointed, like in the middle of a session, when I realized that I had no idea what this place I was talking about was supposed to look like, and so I sort of had to, like, kind of patch over that, because I think it is easy to, like, it's something that if you want physical detail or a feeling or a visual impact, you have to think about, right? Like, you can write, like, things like fairy tales, or like the stories in Boccaccio or the Canterbury Tales or whatever, often don't have a lot of, it's just the story of what the characters are doing, and like you're assumed to know what kind of place they're living in because it's about contemporary society, and everyone knows what a village looks like. It's just some village. But but when you're given that we're imagining a fantasy world, allegedly, I think it's worth investing a little more time and thinking about what it looks like, which I sort of didn't do to my total satisfaction in this case. But I think the game still turned out good. A lot of my ideas, I felt like it was interesting that a lot of my material in general, I felt like was pretty, out of central casting or out of stock situations, vaguely stock science fiction or fantasy situations. Like, okay, there's these orbital, aristocrats living in orbital cities who oppress, like, the people down below. That's in a lot of books, but that sort of all ended up being fine, right? Like, it was a fun experience, and there was some depth to it as we sort of got the characters fleshed out. So,
I mean, certainly, like, my character was pretty stock too. I mean, it's not like, yeah. I mean, I think that, like, that's the. So it's kind of an interesting thing, 'cause I'm thinking about this a lot, and over the course of my role playing, is that a lot of my best role playing experiences in the last, like, 20 years, so, like, essentially counting from, like, when I first encountered the Forge, and sort of, like, you can say the prehistory of that is earlier role playing, but since I first encountered the Forge, has been with taking kind of situations that are not that sophisticated or clever, or not that different from kind of a lot of, I don't know, tropes or genre things, but then playing in such a way that it's like, okay, we're not playing so that we can do that trope. We're playing so that we can take this starting point and then go where we want to go with it. And I found that that's been really successful and satisfying, and that I've also have like played with people who, in my opinion, are really worked up on trying to be clever, and I think that in role playing, like, that is sometimes a barrier to actually playing, because we're a writer can sit and has, like, all day to come up with, like, a clever piece of dialogue, or, like, the perfect characterization, or like the perfect description of what the town looks like, right? But what we kind of don't, and that's for some of those things we can prepare, but for a lot of it we don't. And so let's lean into the strengths of the medium, which is, you take something that's sort of basic, or maybe seems like, oh, the monk who, like, is an ex-monk with, like, supernatural powers. Okay, that's super straightforward and basic. It's very cliche. Like, I kept thinking of, like, The Shadow, like, the movie, the not like the actual, like, pulp character, but like the Alec Baldwin movie, The Shadow, or something.
I love that movie.
I also love that movie. But, like, some, like, kind of derivative, like, character, like, not only like a stock character, but, like, the derivative of that, but it's like, well, that's the starting point, and then we can kind of see where we go. And because I'm going to take it in a certain direction, and you guys are going to do your thing in a certain direction. No matter what, it's going to be our own thing, and it's going to be different.
Right.
And I do think it's different because I do think you can play in a way which I'm not as much a fan of, which is to say, like, okay, and I've experienced this mostly playing with people with superhero games where we'll be like, okay, you're Captain America, so like you've got to be just like Captain America is in the comics. And I'll be like, well, I'm happy to be Captain America because I think that's awesome. And I don't have any interest in doing him like the comics, right? So I want to do him like how I would do it if I was writing the comics. I don't want to do him like someone else wrote him in the comics. Like the point is for me to do him myself. But I have no problem being like, okay, in this game I'm gonna be I'm gonna be like, USA Man,
Right.
and he's got a shield. And let's see what happens with him. Like I think that's perfectly fine to start with that stock thing, as long as then we then say like, but it's how I'm going to write him and how I would conceive him. But yeah, so I think that like cleverness or being like overly sophisticated can sometimes just get in the way of like doing what we have to do, because you then set yourself up for being like disappointed and like, wow. Whereas if you are open to like, well, this is this started out stock, but now it's developing our own take on it and our own opinions about it and our own things. So I don't know. That's my that's me being in favor of like, I don't know, I want to be like, I'm in favor of not being creative, but like to like the creativity doesn't
not being too precious about your starting point, I guess.
Right, the creativity doesn't all have to be like up front. Like we want to be in a situation where we're able, and it's encouraging us to be creative in the moment. And I think sometimes being too creative up front makes it harder to be creative in the moment because we're tying ourselves up.
Right.
Whereas you start with sort of, this is like then you can kind of go, you can roll with it. Anyways, that's my thoughts.
That makes sense.
In my Champions Now game, sorry, the last thing is, it's like in the Champions Now game I'm running, like all the guys are all the players, my brothers and his friends, like our friends, they all did like super stock like characters, and it doesn't matter. Like the game, it's like by 2 years into the game, it's like none of those characters are like anything I've seen before in comics.
Right.
Even if that's when they started, they all were sort of like stock characters. Like now, 2 years into it, it's like they're all interesting or weird or kind of not necessarily. It's not all. I mean, I don't think it's like great literature necessarily, but it's ours. It isn't like has nothing to do with like even the inspirational material at this point. It's developed into its own thing. And none of those characters started out like none of the characters started with like, I would say like one of the characters was creative. One of the players came up with a kind of a creative character, and the other ones were like my brother was like, I'm a strong guy who flies and shoots lightning out of his eyes. Yeah. I'm like, okay. I'm like, anything more? And he's like, nope. That's it. Okay, let's go.
Yeah. Anyway.
But I thought this Destina really established some nice themes and some nice setting bits for the game too. I really feel like, that's where we really discovered what the main conflict was going to be, right?
Yeah.
Whereas, or I guess one of the main conflicts, other than our own individuals sparring with the Empire,
right?
But that the overall big picture conflict came into focus then, and I think the time of Destina was really good for that.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Yeah, the whole game kind of coalesced there, and so it started out like with I think I had started out with the situation that you were going to go visit Coricus, who was the dean of this university, and he sort of gave you a place to stay and chatted with you and talked about the situation in the city. And I remember I'm trying to remember the first session we had in Destina. you had made a roll to look for something in the library, and the roll failed, which had interesting consequences. But do you remember what? Do you remember how you had characterized what you were looking for in the library originally?
I do. Unfortunately, I took notes on that. Um,
Okay.
she was looking for um, prophecies from the first Lotus era, from history, to try to see if there's anything from history that was foreshadowing current events.
Right.
And whether or not there are, I have no idea because the roll failed.
Right.
Um,
Out of curiosity,
and
but you were sort of setting up the idea of you getting some kind of edge or advantage in the coming, whatever was to come, right? Like, did you have
right,
something specific in mind? Like, was there a monologue brewing in your head at all at that point, or?
I think a little bit, just sort of, uh, how to say, drawing from both the Elder Scrolls and from Deep Space 9, where the Bajoran prophets, or the 33rd prophecy of Vedic, what's his name, right? So it would have been something like that, and I think that at that point I would have said, here, look, the prophecy says the city is going to join unto the Night Lords or whatever,
Right.
and that would have made that situation a lot smoother
Yeah.
by leveraging the religious belief of people
Right.
to sort of manipulate them on a political level.
Right. And that's kind of an interesting. Well, I can't remember. I mean, but you hadn't necessarily. I mean, the Lotus Seer or you playing her hadn't necessarily decided what side to pick, right? Because
Right.
it
At that
was
point,
it was after that roll failed and you sort of like didn't find anything, and that like I sort of decided as a consequence of that failure, or we sort of, I feel like we sort of negotiated, or I asked you sort of how the Lotus Seer felt about that, or and you were sort of like felt cast adrift or whatever, and like I decided like the way to sort of play that up was to have, so this other character, I had sort of introduced this other character, Farracus, who was an apprentice of Coricus,
yeah.
I had kind of introduced him as being a co student of yours, and so you kind of had a previous semi rivalry. I don't know if I specified that relationship or suggested that or whatever, but that he had kind of a different take, and he was actually, yeah,
That's what I thought too. I mean,
yeah,
I don't know if we explicitly stated it, um, and maybe John remembers if we did or not. But yeah, no, that was my impression. That Farracus. I'm trying to think. Like the Lotus Seer was sort of the, um, or came across from Corcus as sort of his favorite,
mm-hmm.
but she left to do her Lotus Seer thing,
Right,
and Farracus stayed behind, so he was
right,
sort of that, yes, Dad liked you best, but I stayed here. I guess maybe
yeah,
a
yeah.
prodigal son type of thing, right?
Yeah, there was kind of that dynamic, and I think that got brought out a little. But anyway, he approached
Yeah.
you, like after you had failed. I said he approached you, and I'd already decided he was working with the Night Lord. That was part of the scenario, that he was kind of in contact with the Night Lords, and he was trying to push, Coricus to make the vote go the Night Lord's way, and they were potentially willing to take some pretty extreme measures, like up to, like I think I had already decided that they were potentially willing to kill Coricus in order for
Yeah.
Farracus to just take his place and swing the vote. But he had approached you at this point after you failed, in some dramatic way on the bridge outside over the canal, that I decided was him. I think at this point I was thinking like a Venice type of thing, and
Yeah.
and said, I can show you the Night Lord's point of view, right? And then the next sessions, you sort of like beamed up to one of these orbital cities and talked to Lord Austus, I believe was his name, but he's the only representative of the Night Lords that I think we ever saw. And that was, and so you talked to him. He explained a little bit about their point of view. He tried to sort of impress on the Lotus Seer that he had studied her work, and he was like a student of the cultures of the ground world, and that they were kind masters. He was not varnishing anything about what the relationship was, but he said, this is not that bad a deal comparing to being with the Emperor, and tried to sell that idea. And you also saw that they were, they had this culture where they had these weird sort of servant class that was possibly a different species, and they were making these servants with cybernetic parts and updates. And this is where you actually saw Varga again, and he was being converted into a Night Lord servant. And I sort of explained, this is where, I had remembered that you, John, had written as one of your sentences on your characters that you were frustrated that Varga had gotten away from him and will meet again. And so this is my way of kind of reincorporating him. I had sort of thought about what he might have been doing and decided that he was sort of disgraced. I already decided that the Emperor was maybe pretty harsh in a Darth Vader-like way with servants who had failed him. And so he just it started to kind of make sense for him to run to the other side, and he basically threw himself at the Night Lord's mercy and became one of their agents. And so you talk with them a little bit. There was a lot of setup at this point. You talk with them a little bit. You went back down to the surface. You talked with other characters, with Coricus, and got his point of view. I can't remember exactly if I played Coricus as diffident or leading. Well, there were some roles involved in this, and there was also an assassination attempt on Coricus. I think, the Lotus Seer was trying to play it, was kind of trying to slow roll the situation to keep it under her control, and telling people, telling the Night Lords, I'll make a decision when I make a decision, and saying the same thing to Farragus. And so they decided to push the situation by sending Varga to assassinate Coricus, and I think Giacron intercepted it. And I forget exactly how I staged that. That is, I forget if someone made a roll, or I asked for a roll to know what was going on, or if I just sort of staged the situation as, or if Giacron was specifically guarding Coricus.
I think I was.
Okay, so I think you had kind of gotten the gist that maybe Coricus would be threatened if he wasn't compliant, and sort of you decided to keep an eye on him. And I just went ahead and had the thing where Varga went and tried to assassinate him, and you made a couple of rolls to beat off the assassination attempt, but not kill or take Varga into custody. In other words, you had one successful roll and then one failed roll.
Basically.
Yeah. And then I think as the Lotus Seer, Sean, I think you did make a roll to persuade Coricus to, go ahead and go with the Night Lords after the various situations had been discussed. You'd seen the Night Lord's capabilities, and you'd seen how far away the Emperor was, and that his whatever he was doing to defend the Empire wasn't really doing much over here in Destina, right? You sort of came to your own conclusion that you wanted to steer the situation towards them joining the Night Lords, and so it came to pass. And so I sort of in the start of another session, I described, the vote passing and Night Lord emissaries coming and being sort of given the key to the city or given a tour or whatever, that sort of thing. And then the next thing that I kind of introduced to the scenario was like having this Imperial Herald show up, like as kind of a dramatic character who came riding on a griffin and like landing in the swirl of wind, wearing this gleaming white armor with a like mask. I did describe this guy. I did enjoy describing him, and that he was threatening, the city, threatening the Lotus Seer, and saying, the army, the legions are going to come here and crush you and force you to be obedient to the Empire. And so I set that up as a situation for, like you to respond to both the Lotus Seer and then Giacron. I sort of revealed, I think Giacron came face to face with him for a little bit, and I revealed, oh, this is actually Giacron's brother, which again, I had sort of set that up to be the case because I wanted to bring in, like Giacron, you had like this kind of estranged family. It's kind of estranged family as part of your story, yeah. And so I thought it would be interesting to kind of bring that in and see how you respond to that. And so we kind of saw a little bit of back and forth between them. And then, but ultimately he was there to sort of threaten the city into compliance. And then Sean, you as the Lotus Seer, kind of made a role to drive him off. And I forget if we talked about this. I know I thought about having a recorded conversation just to talk about this role, but we can do it now because I still remember. But so you had rolled, so he was there, you had rolled, like we'd sort of established that part of the Lotus Seer's thing was like this stuff with water, with like seeing the future in pools of water and things like that. And so you would come up with this idea that you would like splash some water in the dirt in front of his feet and show him some thing that would like sort of scare him off. And here I remember like it was difficult, there was a little difficult to narrow down exactly what you were trying to do. And I think you, like when you were describing it, you were referencing, well, something in his backstory, like he sees something in the future that's maybe involved in the back. You were sort of trying to involve me without knowing what my involvement was being. And I remember it was a little difficult. Right. And when I thought about it later, I thought it would have been within reason for me to just say, this is going a little over the line of what you can do on a roll, or it's blending a little too far into my territory. But I didn't do that at the time. I didn't think of doing that at the time, but I think it's fine that I didn't, because it turned out to have some very interesting consequences. But that's one of the things. This is one of the things that ended up getting me thinking about the idea that maybe magic was a vector for doing additions or different rules to the pool.
I mean, I don't know. I think that's still within the realm of pool, because like even without magic, because like in the game I played with Ron and Sam, I think at one point Ron made a roll and was like, okay, you tell me why it like you're in charge of the backstory about like why it happened, but like this is why it happened, or like this is what happened. I don't care what he's like. You have to come up, like you pull from your backstory like to explain it, but this is what happened. Like, and I think the role was like like Ron's character found like a sympathetic person within like the bad guys organization.
Okay.
And he's like, and Ron was kind of like, okay, I don't care what the, right? I mean, I don't think he's like that, but he's like, it's your job to like say who that character is, but that's what happened,
So you don't feel like this is asking for a special case or a special resolution. It's just the straight.
I don't necessarily think so. I think you can kind of say like, look, this is, I think as a player you can be like, okay, this is how I want it to turn out, but I can't put I don't know what the pieces, I can't put the pieces there
Right.
together because I can't see everything in your backstory or the prep or whatever.
Right.
But
Okay.
you put something in place and like this is how it turns out, and so I think that's fine.
Okay.
Um,
Well, I mean, especially too. Um, yeah.
on,
No, go ahead.
sorry. On the other hand, like the idea of like magic kind of, I think that's also a good idea too. That like, you could theoretically like, open it up so that like, yes, this, you could narrow it down. You could be like, okay, in this implementation of the pool, you can't do stuff like that unless you have magic. 'Cause
Right.
I think that's like another way to look at it too. Like, um,
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, Sean.
No, that's
No.
okay. No, I think a lot of it too. A lot of the stuff I did with Lotus Seer, I mean, some of it was blatant. I think blatant supernatural or not physical, not physics. But my intention alone, especially with the stuff where I read somebody's future or fate, could have been explained in the context that maybe I was just very good at psychiatry or psychology, right?
Right.
It's like, I can see within Gary Khan's brother, he has like internal conflicts. So maybe I asked leading questions, and it all looks very supernatural, but really it's just me being a good listener and a good observer of people. So there was always the possibility that not all of those situations were explicitly magical. They were just relying either on my personal ability or on the aura of the boost, Lotus Seer, right? It's like, oh, the Lotus Seer says I have internal conflict. I must have some sort of internal conflict.
Yeah.
Right. Without it actually ever being magic.
Yeah, it does feel like a kind of a classic literary device of like, oh, the prophecy comes true, but there's never any, like, we're never given any indication that like any actual supernatural, like, was it coincidence or what, or like the ghost story, was it really a ghost or was it just your imagination, right? That kind of borderline, playing with the borderline of real and the supernatural kind of thing.
Well, yeah, and two, I think that again, some of the inspiration I drew for that was a little bit of like the Bene Gesserit from Dune, which they
I can definitely see
all
that.
those ideas, right? So
Yeah,
they
yeah.
planted all those ideas in people's heads, right? So I think there was probably a lot of that.
Yeah.
The Lotus Seers over the years had planted these ideas in people's heads that we can see your fate, so you better watch out and be nice.
Right. Yeah, that's a good comparison. I can see that. But so anyway, you sort of like, gave him this horrible revelation, and I had to decide what the revelation was. So I think and that's when I basically came up with what ended up being, like, ultimately the final scenario of the game, which is that he came back later. I think we had some kind of wrap up stuff where you said your farewells to the various characters, and then he came back later, but in his clothes, I guess, he had given up being the Imperial Herald, and he was sort of like now also on the run because he revealed that he had foreseen like the Emperor was going to kill his whole family because of this thing that like your father was going to defy him and he was going to have everyone executed. And so he sort of came to you with that and asked for your help in like stopping it from happening. And like at that point, you sort of all got up and you all got on horses and rode off to help with this was the new kind of like goal for the game. And I think Varga sort of tried to horn in on the action. He was sort of, I still sort of idea like the Night Lords had basically assigned Varga to your case, right? Like they were very interested in following you around and seeing what you were going to do in the Empire. And so you sort of like, once again, Giacron sort of like crippled his robot horse to keep him from following them. And I sort of thought about what was going to happen then, and I concluded that he was going to show up later, but not necessarily be able to be like on your case through the whole time. But anyway, then as a result of you sort of riding off from the gates of Destina to go back towards the Empire, I sort of asked you a little bit, like I asked you, like, what do you want to go straight to the capital, or do you think like I just asked, like, do you think there should be like an adventure in between or whatever, and like, I think you sort of said it seemed appropriate for there to be, like, in these kinds of stories, like, stuff happens along the way. And so I thought, well, yeah, that does make sense too. But this is something that kind of fits into like something that I feel like has been bedeviling me along the while for a while, which is that what exactly makes these kind of overland travel sagas interesting, and like what do you do, like, in terms of like old D&D, just like seeing how many miles you go per day and seeing if you encounter 46 bugbears doesn't really seem that interesting to me anymore. But so, like, well, what do you do? And so what I ended up deciding to do is just take a look at some locations on the way. Like, you were going back to Crossways, so I decided to like have you be in Crossways, which was where it started. Like, it made a lot of sense to me to see, okay, this is where it started. What does it look like now? And so I had this sort of thing where there was the army was back in force, like the emperor had like stamped out this like uprising in the mountains, and it was very locked down. And there was also another imperial herald who was psychically searching for your brother Domicron, and your brother was like, I can feel, I can feel him in my mind. He's searching, and that sort of kind of thing. So you sort of head out with some friends you had made in the previous adventure, and I don't know if they even existed necessarily in the previous adventure. I think I just made them up. I just concluded that you must have made some kind of contact, or the Lotus here had talked to some of the citizens, and I extrapolated that presumably they had names and roles. And so you sort of hit out with these people, and kind of like there was a little scene where Domicron was having a nightmare, and like the Lotus Seer went into his dreams and saw that he was being hunted in his dreams by this thing. And you sort of made a roll. This is a neat little thing. You kind of came up with like doing in the dream a ritual to hide him from, Emperor's Eye, which was the name of the guy who was the herald name, the pseudonym of the guy who was hunting him. We found out more later. I think at this point I already knew who he was. I'm pretty sure. But so you sort of successfully hid him from surveillance, and you went on your way without interacting with like the rest of the situation with the army and that things. And so that was kind of an interesting, like, I had kind of set up a situation with these people being impressed in the town, and I was like, well, maybe they'll interact with this person or that person. But you kind of did the thing, you hid out, you did the thing with the dream, and you went on your way. And I was like, yeah, well, that makes sense. I mean, but I sort of thought about that in terms of what I should do next. And I was like, well, just this kind of like, I don't know, Lord of the Rings type thing where we're being chased by the ring wraiths, and like it happens again, doesn't seem to be like, it feels like you did that, and just doing it again isn't going to be interesting. So going from there, I decided, but it was still a long way to the capital, and I kind of wanted to, like, you were going through lands that we hadn't seen before, and I was like, all right, well, I feel like I still want to set up the capital a little more, with maybe a little more backstory about the Empire. And so this is what I was thinking about when I did this next session, where I decided Emperor's Eye, the guy from the sort of antagonist from that session, was going to just go straight ahead to the capital, and he was going to wait for you in the capital, where there was no way, from his perspective, you were never going to hide from him there, like he was so powerful in the capital. But in the meantime, you sort of traveled through the heartland of the Empire, which was very peaceful and secure. Like the army wasn't there, and so you were kind of not bothered much traveling through there, and you traveled to the lands of Giacron's family, like the ancestral lands of Giacron's family, and stayed at the house where there was some old servants who welcomed you, but your family was at the capital. It was in, like, the Senate was in session, and so your father was in the Senate, and everyone had to be at the capital. And so I would just use that for a couple of things. I just wanted to set up Giacron's family from a distance a little bit, just to sort of like see what was coming. Like, I used the occasion of you talking with this old servant to kind of set up some backstory about what you remembered about your father, and him being this sort of religious scholar who was kind of like not very. He was a very important figure in the religious life of the Empire, but he actually, in his private life, was kind of a skeptic about it all, and was kind of had these intellectual friends who would always hang out and make jokes in it. I had a lot of this through the idea that, well, both of your characters are related to a religion or philosophical aspirations in different ways, right? And so I had these servants have this daughter who was in religious school and who was studying these religious ideas. And that's how I had that character in there. I had a bit of an idea. I had been looking at both of your character sheets, and I noticed that the Lotus Seer was still looking for an heir. And so I sort of thought about, like, throwing this character in and seeing if that was a direction that Sean would go, or that the Lotus Seer would go, and it turned out not to be the case. But it was sort of interesting to use this character as a vector to talk about religion and the relationship of, like, what the Lotus Seer was doing, what the Empire thought about religion, and what the Sun Top monks were doing. And that there was this imperial dogma, that there was this sort of, like, big cosmic will or plan for humanity, and that the Emperor's goal was to, like, purpose was in the imperial religion. The Emperor's purpose was to, like, divine what the divine will was, and guide humanity on the right path. What I thought of recently that was interesting to me is that none of this ever ended up being about, like, colorful gods and mythological stories. And I think I was kind of reacting to the fact that, like, the Lotus Seer stuff was always about, like, fate in a very abstract and impersonal way, and the Sun Top monks were sort of abstract and philosophical. And I think I kind of, from there, I just went with the idea that, like, this religion in the Empire was very kind of deistic and philosophical. Like, there wasn't a lot of, like, the figures, like, the personalities that people focus on are actual humans. Like, the Lotus Seer and the Emperor are actual human beings. And then, like, on the god level, it's sort of very vague and mystical. And so that was all sort of worked out in this session. And then I also during this session, I just sort of blundered into the realization that all of this meant that Giacron's father would have actually had a major role in persecuting the Lotus Seer, actually, at least providing the intellectual basis for persecuting her. And, like, I hadn't even, a little embarrassed that I hadn't even thought of that obvious connection when I had been making the preparation, but during the session I was just like, oh, that has to have happened, right? And so then we discussed that a little bit. But for the most part during this session, we just discussed what it was like in the Empire and what you were going. At the end of the session, you decided that Domicron would stay here, that it was better, you sort of convinced him that it was better that he does not get closer to the capital, because he's just him being found is just a liability, and that you and the Lotus Seer would go to the capital yourself and figure it out. And at the end of that session, we sort of thought a little bit about how you decided a little about how you would sneak into the capital. And you made a roll to sort of sneak in disguised as merchants, which failed. And I sort of decided that what that meant, like, you got in, but that someone had spotted the Lotus Seer as the Lotus Seer. One of the
Yeah.
guards had seen her before. We had a little discussion earlier about whether there were statues or paintings of the Lotus Seer, and you decided there weren't, like that it wasn't a very like idolatrous type of faith, but that we knew that people did come to see the Lotus Seer for advice, like coming to the oracle at Delphi to find out what they should do, and that so it was pretty, to me it seemed logical that this would be someone who had come to you in a similar situation before and now realized that you were here sneaking into the city.
Well, I think too, it did. Thinking about that, as far as I felt like at this point, the Empire had probably purged any, like gone a long way to purging any temples or memorabilia related to the Lotus Seer. But that was part of that was part of the Emperor's plan, was to, out of sight, out of mind.
Okay, so we were talking about the Lotus Seer being identified by the guard, and so the session after that, you sort of basically the two big things were. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, John.
I was going to say, well, I think something just to point, I kind of was thinking about this earlier when to bring it up. I think this might be a reasonable point.
Okay.
Is that, I do think, and like, I don't know, for me, there was definitely like the point I think I was pretty clear, like at the beginning, I was like, I'm kind of the Lotus Seer's sidekick in some of this stuff. Like I had an idea of like, okay, in that initial encounter with at Crossways and Varga and all that stuff, I was like, okay, I know what I want to do here. But then after that, I was kind of like, I don't really have a sense of this character, like what he wants to do, so I'll just tag along, which I think was okay, but I think was also, I don't know if it was like maybe a little frustrating to GM, or like not like, or if it felt like I wasn't picking up on stuff, and it was sort of like, part of it was just like, I don't really have a handle on the character yet, or like I kind of, and that part of it goes back to what I was saying before, is like being a stock character is like, that's the danger of like, but that's like the downside of being a stock character, is that like, oh, you don't actually know what they're all about. But I think something that actually helped, what brought it into focus for me was the character of the other like Suntop monk guy, the kind of other renegade Suntop monk.
Oh, that's right. I totally
I
forgot.
didn't really interact with, right? And so again, I think this might have been something you were sort of like, not frustrated, but we're sort of like, oh, John, why aren't you interacting with this?
Yeah, I totally forgot that was the other thing that I had thrown in that Crossways session, was that there was another monk.
Because like I didn't like have Gyricon like actually interact with him. Having said that, it actually became really important, and it then focused on like, okay, now I get what my character's all about. Because with that example of like what he didn't want to be, and that kind of like thinking about like, okay, so that's how the Suntop monk philosophy could be warped to be like,
he was sort
counter-revolutionary or whatever.
Careerist and opportunistic.
It kind of focused me, and then that led me. So that was in my mind when he encountered his family. That it meant that when he encountered his family, it was with this other character in his mind, is like, I don't want to be that guy, and so that then really allowed me to, for the next part of the game, really be like, okay, I know what he's got to do now. But it took me like a couple sessions of being like, I'm kind of the sidekick. I don't really know what this guy wants to do. And I think you threw stuff out there with me being like, but not like not enjoying it, but just, so I don't mean like, like, oh, that's my judgment on your creativity. Right. It was more like, I don't have a sense of like how to connect my guy to that stuff, which is as much about me as anything else. Like, it's not like that's not a criticism of the stuff. It's just sort of like, that's kind of where I found my guy. But then this other thing you threw out, which in I didn't like go have a confrontation with that guy. I didn't have a role with him. I didn't have like a kind of like this big a scene with him, but his existence as like a foil
Right.
helped kind of for me as a player be like, okay, now I get what my character wants to do, because he doesn't want to be that guy, and that like really snapped it into focus for me then. And then his dealings with his family really kind of allowed me to like focus on like, well, how is he, given that he doesn't want to be that guy, like how is he going to deal with this crisis facing his family? That makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And that's really interesting, because what was this? Oh, Zorola was his name.
Zorola, yeah.
Down.
Yeah.
But that's really interesting, because I did like notice that he's sort of like, you weren't directly going at him or anything like that. He had come down from, in the Crossways session, I said he had come down from the mountaintops to preach this sort of like very quiescent, like, meditate to escape your problems sort of thing that was kind of like helping the Empire pacify the people there. And that he was going to go off, he was actually going to go off to the Imperial capital as well, which I ultimately ended up dropping. I actually dropped him. That's kind of funny, because I dropped him from my consideration, because it seemed like, oh, well, he didn't go for it. I guess maybe it wasn't that interesting. But it's interesting that you were actually thinking about that the whole time, and that it informed your characteristic. And I think I'm fine with that. Like, for the duration of this, game, I think I've been in a state of being pretty open to whatever happens. Like, I didn't try to force Zorola. I wasn't like disappointed that like it didn't go anywhere. I was like, well, okay, we'll just move on. Let's move on. Let's try something else.
Well, it's like I mean, I think some of the with GMing, some of the time it's just like, you have you don't know, like you don't know what's gonna really fly, or what's gonna, and it doesn't. And even when players tell you, because you talk about like, oh, you need your players to like tell you what NPC, all flags or there's sort of all these like player directed things, like, oh, your players should write the things. In the Fantasy Napoleon game, pool game, one of the players wrote in their story that their main thing was that they were in love with this woman, and it was like an unrequited love, and that was like the major thing in their life. And I brought that character, that woman character, into the game, and like they had one scene where they like said hi to her, and then they like went off and did something, and then that was it. And it was like okay, and so and it was perfectly fine, and like it was like it wasn't like it wasn't like a big, like I said, I wasn't like, again, I wasn't disappointed or anything like that, but it's just like, oh, you don't necessarily know as a role player, when you're in the moment role playing, like you don't necessarily know, because in that moment it was like, actually that's not the thing that my guy's going to do right now. He's got other things on his mind. He's got to deal with this,
And I think it's fine that, the stuff on your character sheet is like, it's a direction, but it's still kind of provisional, right? So and that's fine that you don't really know how much you want to engage with that stuff until it happens. I think that's the only way it can be. Like, you can't like trying to make yourself care about this woman character once you've encountered the fact that you don't actually really care that much is not going to work, right? So that's fine.
Right.
But it's interesting. But it's interesting that something that superficially, like, my read was that you didn't really care about, but it actually turned out to be something internally important.
Well, I think I brought it out in the game too, when I was talking with the daughter of the servant, of like, oh, I don't want to be like that guy, because I think I referenced him as like,
you did.
I think I did. I think I did reference him as like, okay, this is like that's. So I sort of referenced him, but I wasn't. Yeah, but it wasn't. He wasn't like. It wasn't like Varga. I wrote him on my sheet. Although I did write that into the story a little bit. I think maybe in some way. Let me look what I did. Maybe I didn't. Oh, I guess that's what I meant by like he's now questioning the relevance of the Suntop philosophy. But that came
Right.
about, I think, after meeting with that guy. So it led to that.
Yeah.
For what that's worth.
Right. Okay. And so getting back, so where we would pick up there
Back to
is back to
the city.
the city. So in this session, the two big things were like, okay, the Lotus Seer has been sort of discovered, and Giacron is going to go see his family. So I guess starting with the Lotus Seer, I had this couple come to you with their sick baby and say, "Oh, you're the Lotus Seer. Can you heal my baby?" I think that was sort of a little bit of a curveball because you hadn't done anything that indicated that your character healed people. Like I wasn't really
Right.
thinking about that. This seems like the kind of thing that people show up and ask prophets to do. Like I guess
Yep.
like Jesus, you know.
Right. No, it's true.
So, and so you
Well, yeah.
yeah.
No, I thought that I was thinking along the same lines. Two as well. I think I realized that the whole. I mean, it was cool the way we snuck into the city.
Yeah.
But I think when they came up to her and were like, "Oh, can you hear our baby?" and she was like, "Okay, after this moment, there's no way I'm going to be able to hide.
Yeah.
Right? This is going to, so I can either do this right thing, or I can be selfish." And it's like, no, it's not my time yet. But so that was, for me, was definitely a decision point. It's like, okay, yeah, this would be what she would do, right? She would try to heal the child and mother, and then consequences be damned. Right.
And so you made the roll, and you did spin it in the way that you were sort of using your knowledge or your foresight powers to know what the child needs to heal, and I revealed my complete ignorance of pediatric illnesses. I guess it has the colic or something, but anyway, you healed the child.
Your child has a stomach ache. Should be okay, I promise.
But that sort of led to just people sort of come, word spreading and people coming, and eventually Emperor's Eye did show up and ask you to be say he was going to escort you, he was going to take you into custody, and you were going to get on trial. But before we get to that part, just also while that was going on, or at some point while that was going on, we switched to Giacron and looked at his relationships with some of his family members, and I'd sort of established that we had a sister in town. There was this townhouse in town where they stayed while the Synod was in session, and he had a sister there who was married to someone who was an important military guy in the Emperor, and of course his father was at his office in the Imperial Palace. And I did spend some time describing what the city was like. I made a little map, which I can put on the screen. Hopefully I'll remember to do that. But this idea that it was a kind of a new capital where there's a bunch of new white marble buildings everywhere, and that it had formerly been. I had the whole backstory for the Emperor that I explained to you at some point, of how he took control of the Empire and gained the power of this ancient defensive grid that he was using to protect the Empire and sort of draw political power all into himself. And so, so Giacron was going into the situation, and he talked to his sister a bit, and I kind of characterized your sister as like you were explaining. Oh, the Lotus Seer had seen a vision. You had made some roll, I think, in the last session to see a vision of what actually was happening, or Domicron had described a couple of sessions back had described that there was this threat to your family hanging over. At some point, you had gotten the more specific information that, through this vision power, that your father was going to try to challenge the emperor's, secrecy and control over this technology in the Senate, and that was going to be, a pretext was going to be found to like declare him a traitor and, have him and the family executed. And so that's what you knew going into this. And so I sort of, Giacron told his sister about this, and I kind of characterized her on the spot a little bit as very resistant, and like she didn't want to hear anything that was going to intrude into her kind of bubble of safety and security. And so that was an interesting interaction where Giacron was just sort of frustrated with her, and we got to see how he interacts with his family members. And then we saw Giacron go to his father and talk to him, and you made a roll to talk him down from making his speech in the Senate, but there was a lot of characterization and discussion before that happened. Do you have any particular memories of that or things that stood out?
I don't think so. I think I do know that like these were like at this point, like I know that I did have a handle on my character, so I knew.
Yeah.
Like I kind of knew like, okay, this is what he wants to do with his father, and this is his reactions. So
yeah, I think it kind of all felt pretty natural at this point, just right. But then I think you did go back and check on the Lotus Seer, so I could sort of have you, and so I used that occasion to have you there when Emperor's Eye showed up and took her into custody, and I think you kind of shared a moment where like the Lotus Seer kind of maybe gave a visual, like gave a look to tell Giacron to stand down. Was that kind of what happened?
Yeah, because I think that part of the idea was that it was going to give, if he was distracted with the Lotus Seer, it would give me opportunity to like do my reconnaissance.
Right.
Because I wanted to go look for the secret power source thing.
Right, and so we're getting pretty close to the final sessions here. Right, so the Lotus Seer goes and accompanies Emperor's Eye into custody, and he, reveals that he's actually Rivkin, another character on your character sheet who is another one of your mentors, and you sort of have a little discussion with him where he's kind of regretful but resolute to do his duty and, take you in, but he's sort of reasonably chivalrous about it. I just wanted to like get a little more character into the character, and I thought that was kind of an interesting. I think I had decided that he was Rivkin way back, but I just want to have that do something, or even if it was just a bit of characterization. And
yeah, no, I think that worked out pretty well though. Yeah. I liked having the fact that. I think it actually built the character a little bit. The fact that she, trained under this individual, right, and learned his ways. Probably even knowing that he was loyal to the Emperor, right, and to the Empire. So I think that creates an interesting dynamic between the characters.
Right, and then so the Lotus sort of went into custody, and then in the next session, the two big things we saw. So we saw Giacron go to his brother-in-law and sort of get him to take him to the Emperor's power source, and this was a thing. This was one of those things where you made a roll to say he does it, and I had to figure out, okay, how does he do it, or what's the context with he's doing. It's like that thing in Troll Babe where the player says what the relationship character does, but the GM has control over their voice and how they feel about doing it. And so I was sort of thinking, well, what would make this guy, he's pretty highly placed. I just sort of think, what would make this guy agree to this thing? And so I decided that his angle was he was just going to show you, like he felt he was going to show you what it was all about. And when you saw that, you were going to see that you actually shouldn't take all of these drastic steps. He felt that showing you would like chill you out a little, and in a way it sort of worked. But I mean, he
Yeah.
sort of showed you this sprawling, this ancient like technology of this former culture that the emperor had discovered that controlled basically these sky laser drones and all of this informational systems, and it was designed. The big thing that I emphasized here that I had already decided on in the backstory of the emperor was that this was designed to be controlled by like a whole team of people, like there's a whole institution, and the emperor was trying to do it all himself, and that he was like putting huge demands on his life force to just like be the single person in charge of this all of this apparatus, and that was behind all of this soul cauldron and sucking people's souls stuff, and why he was using so much emperor. And he had this sort of backstory. I think I told you about it. It's not super germane, but about how his sort of personal humiliation when he lost a battle led to this sort of wounded pride in him, like demanding to be the soul, the only power, the sole power, in protecting his power from everyone else. And so I think when you saw that, I think you had been thinking maybe there was
Yeah.
like a thing you could smash, but then after seeing this, you decided,
Smash or take control of myself, or
but then after seeing the scope of it, you sort of like decided that wasn't the way to go.
yeah,
And that's kind of like, that's interesting because that sort of goes again to your decision like long ago about what the scope of Geokron's powers were, right? That like
right, yes, yeah,
it is about his sort of personal relationship to movement in space, a lot of it, and it's not really like I'm gonna like lift this whole thing out of the ground or whatever. Like
yeah.
it's not about doing that. And so
Yeah, no, so exactly, yeah. At that point, it would have been like that. Yeah, that's what I mean. It would have been at the end if I was like, oh, but now I can actually do something like that, and it wasn't.
it wasn't set up.
Yeah, it wouldn't have been cool, in my opinion. Yeah, so I do remember thinking like, oh, like that like, oh yeah, Gyricon was pretty not demoralized, but definitely felt like, okay, I got to rethink that. But I didn't. I guess I can jump. I did not come up with a plan. Like I didn't certainly think of it, and like the way I conceive it is that neither to Garican, he didn't like. At that point, he was sort of like at loose ends. He's like, I guess I don't know. I'm gonna have to kind of wait and see. As I was too. I mean, sort of like I was like, oh, this is this is not going to be easy. It's going to, or it's not good. I got to figure something else out, essentially.
Yeah. And so you came from that, and so that's where you came away from that. And so meanwhile, with the Lotus Seer in captivity, there was a scene where the Emperor approached her, or came to her cell in captivity. I decided it was time to see the Emperor, right? And so
right.
I sort of had him approach her with an offer where he was, because we had kind of established that she had this like fan base. She had a lot of popular support, and people were very enthusiastic about her coming to the Empire, back to the Empire. And so I was like, okay, so I think the Emperor knows he's got a political problem here, and so he's going to come and sort of like try to sell her on this, give her this, offer her this deal where she'll sort of like quote recant her heresy and agree that like the Emperor is the greatest after all, and whatever, he'll sort of let her back into the power structure, as long as she plays his line. And I think the Lotus Seer sort of played it pretty cagey, but did not comply, right, which was well established to be how she deals with all of these sort of powerful, demanding people.
Well, and I think that's kind of in line. I mean, I guess I could have played her as kind of a con artist too, but
yeah,
there's that fine line between between someone who believes in what they do and then it's sort of it's con artistry. But I think that in both cases, they are non-committal. They're only apparently committal. right? But really, it's I'm not committing to anything until the moment where I must commit to something, right?
Right.
And I think that there's a power in the way that frustrates people looking for answers.
Yeah.
So that was part of her. That was the pleasure she got from that. Was like, okay, yeah,
Right.
I'm not going to give you what you want, but I'm not going to not give you what you want.
Right. Yeah, I think that really, and I felt like that conversation was a lot of fun, and really expressed those ideas that you're talking about. And so we, from there, I think that was kind of the end of that session, and the final session, it sort of set up the trial of the Lotus Seer, which kind of naturally, it's very natural the way that took over. You had been going on this errand to save the family, and you kind of just did that by, it was kind of natural how the final thing transitioned from, you got your father to not make the speech, so now the future was going to change, and then like this big trial of the Lotus Seer just happened as a result of like all of these different pieces moving to slightly different places. It just seemed to fit. And so like I opened that final session with kind of the revelation that like Giacron's father was going to be like one of the prosecutorial team, which is something that I thought about. Like it just seemed obvious, like based on his actual job, right, as a sort of religious intellectual, that they were gonna demand that he, or ask him to do this. And so that was a way to characterize him. In your discussion with him, you would sort of, like Giacron had talked to him about, had sort of like opened up the subject of his hypocrisy, and he had already found out, we had already seen that he had a lot of regrets about what he had done and how he had lived his life. And so this is sort of like, I thought this is interesting to present like a final challenge to him where like he has to come through. And I think there was a little conversation with Giacron, right, where you had Giacron say, no, you have to play this straight. You can't do anything heroic or,
Yeah, I was like basically, please keep being a hypocrite.
Yeah, right.
I think that's what
to save the family. Like you have to think about the family is what you told him. And so we saw this trial session where all the people are there, or the senators are there, and the emperor is there presiding over it all. And then there's sort of a little back and forth between some of the prosecutors with the Lotus Seer, but the big sort of like character thing is Giacron's father questioning the Lotus Seer about her heresy, or like accusing her of being a heretic, and how does she respond. And this was sort of fun to me. I kind of like was trying to get into the character, like being reluctant at first, but kind of warming up to what he's actually good at. Is like fencing over these like religious hypotheses and things like that. Yeah. And so we got to see a little characterization, but then I sort of asked for, you kind of made like the characters sort of like positioned themselves as to what their statements were going to be, and like the Lotus Seer kind of positioned herself as where she stood on whether she was going to admit to this or not, or whether she was going to admit to heresy or not. And sort of, I think you had her kind of like throw his statements back in his face and challenge them. And I sort of like, it's like we need to lead up to a role where like we find out what impact your statements have. And I'm trying to remember exactly what was going into that role in terms of what you had said. I don't know how well you remember it, but it basically had to do with, you were challenging the emperor's sort of ability to,
yes, right.
To actually sustain.
Yeah, I think it was challenging his authenticity.
Right.
You're not, what I do has a real effect, right? You can see me do the things, right? Whatever, regardless of what it really is. Whereas you're just some dude with some drone lasers,
Right.
right? And
Serious.
you know, there's nothing, basically, there's just nothing divine. I think the
Yeah.
core of the idea was that there was nothing divine about what he was doing.
Yeah. And so, oh, and I forgot to mention earlier that you did also, Varga showed up here in the Empire to talk to Gideon
Yeah.
again and attempt to horn in on his scheme or enlist Giacron in his scene, and you had a little scene where you kind of like, did you like you physically, well, you kind of physically manhandled him a little and ultimately just sort
Yeah.
of like
Get him out.
rejected him, but he sort of escaped again. I forget exactly how that went. I know Giacron was frustrated and punched a pillar or
Punch a tree instead of him.
because
Yeah. Yeah.
Vargas slipped away. But
I mean, I kind of let him go. Well, I didn't
Yeah.
want to.
or yeah, you
I didn't want him to help me, but like I also didn't. It was the wrong time to like
have a big fight,
Yeah.
right?
fight with him, especially
Anyway, I wasn't
I
sure.
just-
How,
oh,
yeah,
good.
I wasn't sure how long how much of that conversation would go on. So I did have all this stuff about Varga, how Varga had snuck in, like how he couldn't use the transmat beam while he was this close to the Emperor, so he had like, I don't know, snuck in somehow and all of this stuff. But
Because like I started the session because I like I said at the end of the prior session I really didn't know what to do, but then at the start of the session I think I was part of the role play, which was like, okay, I don't want to do this, but I think I've gotten I don't if I can't take the drone away from the Emperor, or if I guess I was thinking if I can't destroy the drone or take it away from the Emperor, because in doing so we become vulnerable to the Night Lords, I just have to get rid of the Emperor,
Right.
So it wasn't a conclusion he wanted to come to, but it's kind of what he ended up coming to.
Right, and so when we go back to that scene where Sean was making this roll for the Lotus Seer, you were actually like, Giacron was there, Varga was also there, lurking somewhere,
Yeah.
like you saw him. And then you succeeded in this role to sort of like impugn the Emperor's like validity, and I decided that you were going to piss him off into making this openly threatening show of force where he blows the roof out of the building and brings the drones down to just threaten you directly as a show of force. And that's kind of when like the big
Yeah, and I think I had originally thought like maybe I would even wait and try to attack him like after the trial, or like in another location, just to kind of not implicate my father, implicate the Lotus Seer and all this. But once he did that, I was like, I gotta act now.
Yeah.
He's now like. So,
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Like that's how So it's just, again, the decisions are not like. I think like when playing. I mean, I noticed that a lot. Playing this game, playing Sorcerer. I might have an idea of like, oh, this is what I want my character to do, but then in the moment, I'm like, nope, got it. That's.
Yeah.
Turns out no. Like, no, I don't want to wait till afterwards. I got to deal with this now.
Yeah.
So I think that's like a good. I think that's like a good sign. That means things are. I'm reacting to what's going on and not.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Well, I was hoping. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, no, you go first, Sean. Just.
Okay. For me, that whole last scene really was trying to set up Gurkhan's moment, right? So that's what the Lotus Seer is trying to do. She's trying to set up the moment, and I realized it was a bit of meta thinking, because we hadn't really discussed that between the two characters, right? The two characters hadn't said, "Hey, I'm gonna set your moment up. You be ready." It was much more relying on what I knew about what was going on, but I think it worked really well. I just didn't know if that was part of John, if that was part of your plan, or that would be how you wanted to things, or when you wanted to do the thing you wanted to do. So.
I guess it's sort of like, I think by doing it, you made it the when I wanted to do. So I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
Like I would not have done it at that time had what you did had the way your role turned out not happened the way it did. I might not have made that decision. So it was certainly yeah, I mean, it was certainly like dependent on that result for what happened next. Yeah. I guess, and that's what I mean, because if had I just kind of based on my plan, otherwise would have just been, oh, wait till it's over and catch him someplace else and not complicate things here. But when that happened, I was like, no, I've got to do this now.
Right.
So. Garricon was like, I can't let this guy's being violent. He's might turn the drones on people here, my parent, my father, the Lotus here, etc. Anyway.
Yeah. And I think too, kind of getting back maybe to the point we talked about before, but I made my roll, but then like if you'd said, well, he's going to turn the lasers on you, I wasn't going to say, oh, I'm going to roll for that. I was just going to be like, okay, he turns the lasers on me.
Oh, interesting.
Right. I was just going to let that happen.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Interesting.
So that would have been. So thank you for also saving my character's life. But no, she was ready for that moment. She's like, okay, this is how it's going to play out, and if he blows me to smithereens, he blows me to smithereens.
That's interesting. But he didn't. But so instead, Giacron rolled to attack the Emperor, right? And I gave you 3 dice on the roll because of all the setup. It's interesting. I was sort of thinking, well, I could have taken one away again because it's the Emperor, and this sort of goes to what I didn't. It's fine. But I've talked a little before about how, like, I think it's worth contemplating the idea of maybe you could have a pool game where you give powerful antagonists a little beef, either by, like I had mentioned, the idea of they could like just subtract a die from your roll, and you have to overcome that. Another one I thought of was they could tax you a pool die when you attack them. Like, you just have to pay a pool die and it goes away before you can attack them. That way, like, they always leave a mark. Like, you can't get away unscathed. Those are just some ideas floating through my head. But in this case, I gave you the 3 dice. That's fine. And so you kind of like crippled the Emperor. Like, you came up from behind and like, punched him. Martial arts punched him in the back and sort of crippled him. And I think you took the monologue specifically to describe him not being dead, but very, devastated.
Being in pain and so in such pain and so visibly in pain to like embarrassed, be like, just like lose all face and lose all,
And you were kind of wavering on this detail, I think, but you did decide to add the drones falling, like him losing control of the drones.
Yes.
And I think maybe you checked in with me on that, and I was fine. Like, it looked like you were kind of checking in with me on the...
Yes, to see if like that, because just to double check if that's how they worked.
Right. Yeah. And I felt that was the thing that would happen.
Because that's like another thing where it's like it's your job to actually say how those worked or like what would happen in this situation, but sort of like, so if this is possible, this is what it would be.
Yeah. And then
if not, kind of tell me what the equivalent would be here.
Okay, and so I agreed that the drones kind of fall and go silent for that. And then I immediately after that happened, I immediately thought, is that a Bengal kitten, Sean? No, that's not what I thought. But
she's just a tabby.
Just a tabby, okay. But I immediately thought, oh wait, like, well, if that happened, like if Varga is there and he sees the drones drop, he doesn't have to.
Right.
Like, he just has to beam up and tell the Night Lords party time. Like,
yeah.
And so I decided that's what happened then. So that's one thing that happened. You saw that happen. And then Emperor's Eye was also in the room, so I decided that, and then he's going to jump in and defend the Emperor and attack Giacron. And so, you sort of had a little fencing match with him, which you won, and sort of described him just being unable to touch you or interact with Giacron in any way because you were just using these movement powers to frustrate him. And you were pretty particular about making sure that this was partly like a political humiliation. There was an element where you wanted to make sure that it was clear that the power of the Emperor was not gonna be helpful, so that for everyone to see. And then at that point, Lotus Seer, Sean, you rolled for the Lotus Seer. Well, what was your thought process at that moment, Sean, when you decided, the Lotus Seer was going to pick this moment to find an heir, basically?
Well, part of it was like, if I'm ever going to do this thing,
right? Yeah.
Now's the moment, right? Because all along the way, I'd been looking for moments that I thought were dramatically, like, and John and I briefly talked about this a little bit, and he had said, don't necessarily wait for the right moment, and I agree with that. But the right moment did present itself, I think. So, this worked really well, and originally I thought about the one Lotus Seer character adherent from Destina, right? The noble woman.
Yeah, I remember. I think I actually did kind of spin her that way. I think I had that find an heir thing in mind when I kind of set some of those characters up back in Destina. So,
and she'd actually also considered, I considered the Emperor himself.
Oh,
right, saying, here, let me show you all the things you need to know, right? But then, finally at the last, I was like, okay, Giacon's father, right, is this really interesting character that we've met the last few sessions. And would it be interesting if he were the one, right? So that was my thought process of that.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting, like sort of it's kind of that, I don't know, it's kind of almost the Saul at Tarsus moment, or Damascus, road to Damascus moment, where like the hypocrite, or not well, in this case, the religious hypocrite who's persecuting you, like suddenly sees the light. Like it's literally it's literally so like that. Anyway, but you made that role, and then you sort of like described him. I forget if you described or I described, or we kind of like traded a little bit, but him basically seeing all of the things that you knew and kind of like having this cosmic vision of what his purpose was. And so at that point, to a certain extent, with this very last part, like I did move into, I do think I kind of moved into like tidy up for the last session mode, in terms of having him like he sort of like takes the Emperor's thing. I mean, we did play through, we did describe him like asking you to like, someone to cut him up. There's a lot of little characterization details that happened here that were kind of funny, but he like plugged the Emperor's thing into his whole that sounds terrible, but plugged in the Emperor's machine connection, cybernetic connection, whatever, to take control of the drones. As the Night Lords were coming down, like their little raiding ships were coming down, and he fought them off. And meanwhile, as the Night Lords were getting destroyed, Varga, I'll just wrap this up basically. Varga came down and was like shocked that the defense system was still up. He thought it was down because he thought the Emperor was dead. I I had already decided that was the case, that he saw you do. He didn't think the Emperor could still be alive and the defense system would be up. So that's anyway. And he was just frustrated and attacked Giacron in a final thing. And then, interestingly, as Giacron, you had Giacron talk to Emperor's Eye at that point and say, this is your enemy. This is the person you should be fighting. And so I actually decided to make that a roll and had you roll to like persuade him to fight for you, and you succeeded. And so I had Emperor's Eye kill Varga and sort of wrap that up. And I believe that was the last roll.
I think so.
And then we kind of saw I kind of wanted to set up a little epilogue where, you kind of see the results of, like your father, like taking control of the empire and trying to like rule it in a different way, where he's got he's going to try to recreate the kind of like distributed power. Like there's a whole bunch of people who are helping to defend the empire. I'm not taking it all to myself. And so we see you sort of like watching that ceremony where he inducts all these people, and you have a little exchange with like, the Lotus Seer now is not the Lotus Seer anymore. And so she's just sort of, she's got a sword that she took from borrowed from Emperor's Eye, because she needs to protect herself like the old-fashioned way, and she's going to set off in search of a new name for herself. And so that's kind of like where we left it, setting up the sequel, as I thought, which may happen one day, but that, and so that's where, and so that's how we wrapped it up. Like I said, this has sort of happened before, that I feel like that at the end, the kind of wrap-up-y tasks, I always wonder if I, as the game master, am pushing too hard, or at least that's happened before, for the wrap-up, like what's the right thing to do. On the other hand, like I kind of don't want this to keep going on. I don't know.
Right, yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm not sure what still not totally sure what the right balance is between, like sticking to the material, sticking to what the material is telling us to do, and like trying to get the conclusion. I mean, the conclusion was a result of the rolls you made. Like there's no question about that. It's just like did every character like get their due consideration? Like was Varga owed more, or was he not? I don't think so, but it's something I could think about, right? Zorola comes to mind as an example where, like I said, I kind of swept him. We had that whole conversation, but I did kind of sweep him aside because I just didn't want to deal with him with all this other stuff going on. And so, that's sort of something I still kind of think about. But
yeah.
No.
Well, yeah. No, go ahead.
You go first, Sean.
Okay, I was just gonna say, like, not everybody can make it to the end character-wise.
Yeah.
That I thought that other Suntop monk was going to be a major player at the end, and he wasn't. Which is why I went and like listened to him, right? And that was fine, But it was interesting, but we didn't go with that, and that's great, because I still liked his moment in the story. Right, and obviously for John it was important in that regard, even though we're just going to basically a snapshot of this character, right?
Right.
Yeah, I think I think you don't want to be in a position where you are ever making I think it's dangerous for players or GM to be like, oh, I'm going to make a decision because I want to pace this the right way.
Right.
because then then it becomes like a lot. Then you're taking on like this sort of responsibility that is out. I don't know, that leads you to do things that like aren't. I don't know. It leads you. Then you got to juggle too many things. It's like if you're playing your NPCs and you're as the GM and as the characters were like, okay, I'm playing the character, then this thing will be what it is, and it might be over quickly or it might take 5 sessions or something. But then at least you know that's what it is. I feel with like the main thing, the main control over pacing that the GM has is, do you introduce new stuff or do you just play out with what's on the table? And I kind of feel that like once you've got enough stuff on the table at some point, like, okay, I've got enough stuff on the table, and then as long as I as the GM don't add new things, then the pacing is going to be what it is, and I don't have to worry and be willing to. And I think you're right. Like you got to be willing to say like, nope, this is Varga is done here.
Right.
Yeah, this is. I'm not going to have him hold on or like come back. This is the last time we see him, and so I think that's like a good. I mean, I think it's good to be sort of ruthless as a GM with some of your villains or NPCs when it's be like, okay, I'm not gonna have a I'm not gonna hold on to these guys. I'm in one of the other pool games I'm playing, they're one of the I don't know, one of the antagonist characters, one of the bad guys, I was the one of the players took action to get them killed or whatever, and I was like, okay, they're killed off essentially. I mean, we had a role and we played it out. It wasn't exactly like that, but the players I think were a little like, wow, I thought those were like really important NPCs, and I thought we'd be seeing a lot more of them. But I was like, well, then, but what happened is they got killed. Like that's what the roles say. Like it turns out they weren't as big a deal as in that way. Like they weren't as big a deal in like the way of like building them up to be like a boss. It's like
right.
Now we can look at now it's like the question might be what are the implications of them being gone or being killed or whatever. But if I had been like, I'm gonna let them get away because I'm worried about the pacing,
Right.
then same thing with like in playing in my Champions Now game where it's like they finally track down one of the bad guys who's been like harassing them the entire 2 years, and I'm like, oh, they figure out a way to find his secret base, and I was like, oh, I guess, and I was sort of like, oh, well, that's sort of anticlimactic. They just found his base and they can go beat him up now. But I'm like, no, it's not actually anticlimactic. That's actually how it works. Like,
Right.
I shouldn't be like manipulating or worried about that. It's like, okay, the rules tell us they found it. That's what the rules say. They should go beat him up or not, and then that's it. And that's the thing. That's what happens. And so I think that like, that's the main. My main point is like the as a GM, once you've got all your things on the table, then the pacing is gonna, it can basically take care of itself, and like that's the one thing the GM has to like mess with pacing or change the length of the game or change the how much is just to add. You can add more, and like the question of like, well, how much is too much or when to add? It's sort of up to the individual, but like, I think as long as you're, like legitimately like being willing to like, okay, I'm going to resolve this stuff that I put into play. Like you don't want to be in a position where you're like, I'm going to keep this going because of some reason of my own.
Right.
I need to keep him there because of something else I want to happen later. Like that's, you can't think like that, right? So even more benign forms of that, it's like, oh, I don't really have a good idea for him, but I want to keep it going or not, or like, in terms of like the epilogue piece is sort of like, I think it's nice to say like, okay, what does it look like these guys are doing next? I don't know if that's something you were thinking about too. It's like, oh, it's like okay, because you could theoretically, be like, well, now that the things have changed, what are you doing? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
are we starting again? Like, right? But
Right.
but that's in a game like the pool, it's sort of something you just sort of notice. It's like, okay, and it doesn't. It's not just something you're aiming for. It's just sort of like, okay, that's sort of what it, you know. Oh, I guess you sort of notice it in retrospect. It's like, okay, yep, that's it. Like I kind of, if there are things still on the table, it's like none of us are like, we're not like, we've resolved the stuff that we were like really concerned about, and now like
Right.
the other stuff is there. We could pick it up again, but it really is about if we keep going, it is about picking up new stuff and like putting
Right.
new stuff into play, because there may be things, there may be like loose ends or something, but there's not enough to really like jump without someone doing much more work to prepare something, you know. And I think that's sort of, you know, notice it's like, okay, the situation has changed, like there's like a
Right. We would.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. We would just we'd need
because yeah, you could be like, okay, what do you do now that your father's the emperor?
Right.
But you know, really, like that's a new story.
Yeah.
Like this is the story about how like maybe this is the story about how my father became the emperor, and then the story of like, okay, what happens once he's the emperor? That's part 2. Like it's not. It's a time for us to stop, because if we did. Because you would be in the position, if we wanted to go on, to be like, okay, I got to add a bunch more stuff now.
Right.
Like it isn't, you know.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I don't know if
it makes sense.
Follows what you were talking about. But.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. Yeah, in a way it does. It's just yeah, kind of like we're at the end of the track, and it's just, you know, we would need more. Given that all of these things have come to here, this is a good place to like. Well, what am I still worried about? Well, one thing that I was thinking about is the emperor. Like, you specifically didn't kill him, and so one thing I thought about in the fight. I think I briefly floated through my mind whether he like summons his enormous willpower and stands up beside himself and like fights for control of the drones. Like that may have flickered through my head, and I just decided, no, I don't want to do that. Now, if I was playing a game with NPC character sheets, right, the character sheet would have told me whether I can make that decision or not, right? And so that's just, I guess what I'm saying is sometimes if you don't have the character sheet telling you, you make the decision, but sometimes it's like there's some kind. I feel like this kind of phantom pain of like, where's my character sheet that tells me what to do, tells me what my options are, but my options are at that point are pretty broad. Yours are too, right? But it can feel like. But that's where I sort of got into the worry about whether, like, am I pushing this by myself to the conclusion? You know, I did make a lot of leaps in terms of the consequences once the Lotus Seer passed on her fire to Giacron's father. I extended the consequences of that pretty far, right? To he takes over, he knows how to use the drones, and he uses the drones and he kills the knight. Right. And so I guess that's the point at which I say, that's the point at which I need to like focus down on like, was that too far to take the consequences, and did I take it that far for ignoble reasons? I'm not super worried. I'm not super worried about it, but that's the technical dilemma that I would be addressing.
Well, I mean, you think though that the pool has a sort of built-in balance for that, because either or both of us could have said, no, you go ahead and describe what happened, I'll just take my point, I'll just let I die, right?
Right.
And so if you had chosen to keep the Emperor going in some way, I don't think that would have bothered me. I still think we'd end up more or less the same place we are right now. Right. I think that would have been. I still think we would have ended up there.
Yeah,
in some, maybe
right,
not
in
in
the sense
exactly
that-
the same fashion, but yeah, we still would have.
but in the sense that your successful roles were in the situations that sort of determined where the ultimate stakes were on the line in your
Right.
in your roles, and you succeeded in them, and so that sort of sets the tone for, like, this is you winning, like, what you set out to do here, and not losing and having to start over again or run away or whatever. Right. So yeah, I mean, I think in that sense it went fine. Just something I sort of was trying to, like, I think I adequately expressed what I was trying to express there, or like the kind of like dilemma
Yeah.
that's in my mind sometimes in those situations. So, and so I think that's basically what I had in mind to say and to talk about. Did either of y'all have any final thoughts?
No, I think I hit the main points I wanted to. Yeah, I wanted to talk about kind of the inflection point and finding my character, and that was my main topic of interest, or well, the main thing I wanted to mention. But no, otherwise, I think we
Okay.
covered most of my.
Yeah,
points to
but
talk about.
I think my character got a great arc, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like that began and wrapped up in a very satisfying way. And of course, I think I mentioned this in the previous video too, but so this was my first time playing pool, and definitely where before I was like, I don't know about this pool game, but no, it was very satisfying, and I quite liked the pool quite a bit.
Yeah, good. All right, well, thanks for talking, and I will see y'all later, and hopefully have this up on the website soon.
Sounds good. Cool.
All right,
Sounds good. Talk to y'all later.
talk to you
See you
later.
guys.
Bye.